Imagine a world where privacy did not exist, where the church dictated exactly how you could sleep with your spouse, and where a visit to the doctor could be deadlier than the disease itself. From the toxic makeup that slowly poisoned noblewomen to the horrifying reality of medieval hygiene, what was life really like behind closed doors? Tonight, we strip away the fantasy. Close your eyes, settle in, and let's uncover the private, unfiltered, and unsanitized history of the Middle Ages. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're ready to leave the noise of the day behind, just lie down, close your eyes, and let's drift into the past together. Relax and enjoy the story. To understand the reality of intimacy in the Middle Ages, one must first strip away the satin layers of Hollywood romance and Victorian fantasy. The modern mind often conjures images of gallant knights and swooning damsels, of secret trysts in moonlit gardens, and of a world driven by courtly love. But the grim reality of life between the 5th and 15th centuries was far removed from these poetic ideals. The true story of medieval private life is not found in the songs of troubadours, but in the dusty records of church courts, the medical texts of confused physicians, and the architectural limitations of a world built of cold stone and drafty timber. It is a story governed not by passion, but by property, religion, and the relentless struggle against dirt, disease, and the cold. To step into a medieval bedroom is to step into a world where privacy was a foreign concept, where the church claimed authority over the most intimate moments of human existence, and where the smell of unwashed bodies and wood smoke was the pervasive backdrop to every encounter. If this story is helping you relax, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next journey into history. Let us begin with the environment itself, for the physical setting dictates the nature of human behavior. In the year 1250, in a typical European town or manor, the concept of a bedroom as a private sanctuary did not exist for the vast majority of the population. For the peasantry, who made up the bulk of society, the house was often a single room. This room was a multi-purpose space where cooking, eating, working, and sleeping all took place within a few hundred square feet. In the center lay the hearth, an open fire that provided the only source of heat and light. At night, the fire would die down to embers, casting long, dancing shadows against walls made of wattle and daub, a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. In this single room, the entire family slept together. A husband and wife did not have the luxury of a door to close against the world. They shared their sleeping space with their children, their elderly parents, and often, during the harsh winter months, their livestock. It was not uncommon for a peasant family to sleep on a straw pallet on the earthen floor, huddled together for warmth, while a cow or a pig shifted and snorted in the corner of the same room. The animal heat was a necessary survival tool against the biting cold, but it added a pungent layer to the olfactory experience of the night. In such a crowded environment, intimacy was a hurried, silent act, stolen in the moments of darkness when the rest of the household was asleep, or perhaps taken outdoors in the fields or barns, away from the prying eyes of kin. Even for the wealthy, privacy was a rare commodity. In the great stone castles of the nobility, the lord and lady might have a great chamber, But this was rarely a place of solitude. The bed itself was the most expensive piece of furniture in the house, a massive structure of oak, hung with heavy wool or velvet curtains. These curtains were not merely decorative, they were functional walls, designed to create a room within a room, trapping body heat and shutting out the drafts that whistled through the unglazed windows. But beyond those curtains, the room was alive. Servants, ladies in waiting, and sometimes even political advisors slept in the same room, often on trundle beds that pulled out from underneath the master's bed, or simply on pallets on the floor. A king or a duke was almost never alone. He was dressed by others, undressed by others, and watched over while he slept. To be intimate with one's spouse in such a setting required a suspension of shame that the modern mind would find difficult to comprehend. The heavy curtains provided a visual barrier, but they could do nothing to muffle sound in a stone room that echoed every rustle of straw and every whisper. Beyond the lack of privacy, the medieval experience of intimacy was profoundly shaped by the pervasive influence of the Catholic Church. Today, we view what happens behind closed doors as a personal matter, but in medieval Europe, the Church sat metaphorically and sometimes literally on the edge of the bed. The clergy believed that the sexual act was the original sin, the mechanism by which the fall of man was transmitted from one generation to the next. While marriage was a sacrament, the act itself was viewed with deep suspicion, tolerable only because it was necessary for procreation. This suspicion manifested in a complex web of rules and regulations that dictated when, how, and why a couple could lie together. The Church developed penitential manuals, guidebooks for priests to use during confession, that cataloged every conceivable variation of the act and assigned a specific penance for each. These texts reveal a society obsessed with categorizing and controlling desire. For example, intimacy was strictly forbidden on all feast days and fast days. When you calculate the number of holy days in the medieval calendar, including every Sunday, the 40 days of Lent, the period of Advent before Christmas, and the feast days of major saints, it becomes clear that for a pious couple, there were fewer days when relations were permitted than when they were forbidden. Some historians estimate that if a couple strictly followed all church laws, they would be barred from intimacy for nearly half the year. Furthermore, the church dictated the natural position for relations. Anything other than the missionary position was considered a sin against nature, a deviation that required penance. The reasoning was not merely moral, but medical and hierarchical. It was believed that the man, as the superior vessel of reason, must always be above the woman, who represented the inferior vessel of flesh. To invert this order was to invert the natural hierarchy of God's creation. While it is impossible to know how strictly these rules were followed in the privacy of the dark, the fear of hellfire was a potent psychological dampener. A husband and wife might lie together in the dark, terrified that a moment of pleasure could result in the birth of a deformed child, a common medieval belief that attributed birth defects to intimacy during forbidden times or in forbidden ways. Then there was the matter of hygiene, a subject that is often glossed over in romanticized retellings of history. The medieval world smelled. It smelled of unwashed bodies, of wood smoke, of roasting meat, of open sewers, and of animal manure. The modern obsession with daily bathing and deodorizing simply did not exist. This is not to say that medieval people were filthy by choice. They washed their hands and faces regularly, and public bathhouses existed in many cities until the late Middle Ages, when fears of the plague closed them down. However, a full-body immersion in hot water was a luxury of time, fuel and labor that few could afford on a regular basis. If this story is helping you relax, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next journey into history. For the average person, the laundry of the body was done with a linen cloth and a basin of water. Linen was the primary undergarment for both men and women, worn next to the skin to absorb sweat and oils. It was believed that changing the linen shirt or chemise was more effective at cleaning the body than washing the skin itself. A wealthy person might change their linen every day, presenting a clean, white appearance to the world, while their skin underneath remained unwashed for weeks. The accumulation of natural scents was masked, not removed. The wealthy used heavy perfumes, rose water, and sachets of dried herbs like lavender and rosemary tucked into their clothes. In the context of intimacy, these sensory details are crucial. A lover's embrace in the Middle Ages was an experience of intense, unfiltered humanity. There was no mint toothpaste. Oral hygiene consisted of rubbing the teeth with a rough cloth and chewing on herbs like parsley or mint to sweeten the breath. Dental decay was common, though perhaps less rampant than in the sugar-saturated modern era. There was no deodorant. The scent of a partner was the scent of sweat, old wool, smoke, and perhaps the faint metallic tang of the herbs used to ward off fleas. And fleas were everywhere. They were the great levelers of medieval society, infesting the beds of peasants and kings alike. The records of royal households often include payments to flea catchers or instructions for treating bedsheets with wormwood to repel the insects. Imagine the reality of a romantic interlude interrupted by the biting of fleas or the scurrying of lice. It breaks the spell of the romance novel, but it grounds us in the itchy, uncomfortable truth of the era. The bed itself, often a mattress of straw for the poor or feather-stuffed ticking for the rich, was a haven for vermin. Changing the straw was a chore done perhaps once a year, meaning that the bed was a living ecosystem of its own kind. Medical knowledge regarding the human body and reproduction shaped the experience of intimacy. Medieval medicine was based on the ancient Greek theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was a balance of these fluids. Men were considered to be hot and dry, while women were cold and moist. Intimacy was seen as a medical necessity for men, a way to purge excess heat and seed. If a man abstained for too long, it was believed he could suffer from a buildup of toxic vapors that would affect his heart and brain. Conversely, too much intimacy was thought to cool the man excessively, shortening his lifespan. This created a delicate anxiety around the act. It was necessary for health, yet dangerous in excess. For women, the medical understanding was even more convoluted. Physicians believed that a woman's womb was like a hungry animal that could wander around the body if not satisfied, causing hysteria and illness. This wandering womb theory persisted for centuries. Furthermore, there was a widespread medical misconception that a woman could only conceive if she experienced pleasure, orgasm, during the act, as her seed needed to be released to mix with the man's. While this might sound progressive, in the grim context of medieval law, it was used as a weapon. If a woman became pregnant from an assault, legal scholars often argued that she must have enjoyed it, otherwise conception would not have occurred. This biological fallacy caused untold suffering and silenced victims for generations. The very purpose of marriage, the only sanctioned arena for intimacy, was rarely romantic love. Marriage was a contract, a merger of assets, a diplomatic treaty. Among the peasantry, a man looked for a wife who was strong, who could brew ale, spin wool, and work the fields. A woman looked for a husband who had land, however small, and the physical strength to protect it. Attraction was a secondary bonus, not a primary requirement. Among the nobility, the stakes were higher. Children were betrothed while they were still in the cradle. A 12-year-old girl might be married to a 30-year-old man she had never met, simply because her father needed to secure a border alliance or gain a title. The wedding night was therefore not the culmination of a courtship, but the awkward, terrifying meeting of two strangers who had been sold to one another by their families.
The wedding night in the Middle Ages was not the private, romantic culmination of a relationship that modern audiences might expect. In fact, for the nobility and the upper classes, it was a public spectacle, a legal necessity that required witnesses to ensure its validity. This brings us to the bedding ceremony, a ritual that highlights just how little privacy existed in the medieval world. After the wedding feast, which was often a rowdy affair filled with heavy ale and ribald jokes, the bride and groom were stripped of their clothes by their friends and family. This was not done in seclusion. The bride was undressed by her ladies, and the groom by his men, often amidst a cacophony of shouting, cheering, and bawdy advice. They were then marched to the bridal chamber, a room that had been ritually prepared. The bed was not merely furniture, it was a stage. A priest would be present to bless the bed, sprinkling it with holy water and reciting prayers to drive away demons and ensure fertility. The fear of impotence was rampant, often attributed to maleficium, witchcraft or curses cast by jealous rivals. The priest's blessing was a spiritual shield against the failure of the flesh. Once the couple was placed in the bed, often naked, the curtains were not immediately drawn. Family members, parents, and witnesses would stand around the bed, observing the couple to ensure they were actually together. In some traditions, they would watch until the couple touched. In others, they would remain in the room, drinking and joking until the couple was physically covered by the sheets. Only then were the heavy curtains drawn, and the crowd would retreat, though often they would remain just outside the door, listening for the sounds that confirmed the marriage had been consummated. This lack of privacy was driven by law. In the eyes of the church and the state, a marriage was not finalized by the vows spoken at the altar. It was finalized by the physical union of bodies. A marriage that was not consummated could be annulled, declared null and void as if it never happened. This placed an immense, crushing pressure on the couple, particularly on the wedding night. For a young groom, perhaps only a teenager himself, the pressure to perform while his father and father-in-law waited outside the door could be paralyzing. For the bride, often younger and completely uneducated in the matters of physical intimacy, the night was often one of confusion and terror. The morning after brought its own grim ritual, the inspection of the sheets. The proof of a bride's virginity, the blood on the linens, was a matter of family honor and economic security. A virgin bride was unspoiled goods, ensuring that any heirs produced were undeniably of the husband's bloodline. If the sheets were clean, the consequences could be disastrous. The bride could be disgraced, beaten, or the marriage dissolved and the dowry returned. This obsession with physical proof led to a secretive, desperate underground economy of deception. Medieval medical texts and household manuals sometimes whispered of tricks to fake virginity. Women who had been with others before marriage might resort to using packets of animal blood, often from a chicken or a pig, concealed in the bed to stain the sheets.
Others used astringent herbs like oak bark or alum to tighten the tissues before the wedding night. It was a high-stakes game of deception played in the dark, driven by a society that valued a woman's chastity above her humanity. But what of those who wished to avoid the consequences of intimacy? In a world without reliable contraception, every act of union carried the weight of potential pregnancy. The Church strictly forbade any attempt to prevent conception, viewing it as a direct interference with God's will. To spill the seed outside of the vessel was a mortal sin associated with the biblical story of Onan. Yet the grim reality of poverty, inheritance laws, and the high danger of childbirth meant that people desperately sought ways to limit their families. The methods of medieval contraception were a mix of superstition, ineffective folk remedies, and dangerous poisons. Coitus interruptus was the most common method, despite the Church's condemnation. Beyond that, women turned to the apothecary and the hedge witch. They wore amulets around their necks or thighs, weasel testicles, mule earwax, or pouches of specific herbs, believing these talismans would ward off pregnancy. When magic failed, they turned to chemistry. Women drank teas brewed from pennyroyal, rue, or crushed iron slag. These were not harmless herbs. They were mild poisons intended to induce a miscarriage or stop the reproductive cycle. Many women sickened or died in their attempts to avoid another pregnancy. It was a silent, secret war waged by women against their own biology, hidden from the priest and the husband.
When prevention failed, the result was pregnancy, a state that carried a terrifying proximity to death. In the Middle Ages, childbirth was the leading killer of women. A woman entering the birthing chamber knew there was a significant chance she would not leave it alive. As the delivery date approached, the expectant mother would often make her confession and write her will. The birthing room was a female-only space. Men, including doctors and husbands, were strictly forbidden from entering. The windows were shuttered tight to keep out drafts and harmful vapors, making the room hot, dark, and airless. The midwife was the commander of this space. She brought with her a kit of grim tools and spiritual aids. She might use oils to lubricate the birth canal, but she also used relics, a girdle of a saint, or a piece of parchment with holy prayers written on it, laid across the mother's belly to speed the delivery. Pain relief was controversial. The Church taught that the pain of childbirth was Eve's punishment for the fall of man, and therefore suffering was a necessary part of the process. However, compassion often overrode dogma, and midwives would administer herbal drafts of poppy or mandrake to dull the agony, though getting the dosage wrong could stop the mother's breathing entirely. If the birth went wrong, the reality became horrific. Without the knowledge of modern obstetrics or the ability to perform a safe cesarean section, a breech birth or a baby stuck in the canal was a death sentence. In these desperate moments, the midwife's role shifted from bringer of life to salvage operator. Hooks and knives were used to remove a fetus that could not be born, in a desperate attempt to save the mother's life. If the mother died before the baby was born, the procedure was even more macabre. A crude cesarean would be performed immediately on the corpse, not to save the baby's life, for the infant rarely survived, but to extract the child so it could be baptized before it died. In the medieval mind, an unbaptized infant was doomed to limbo, denied the sight of God. Thus, the physical horror of the surgery was deemed necessary to save the eternal soul. For the women who survived the ordeal of birth, there was the period of lying in. For a month after the birth,
the woman was considered unclean and was confined to her bed. She could not cook, clean, or attend church. While this was framed as a religious impurity, in practical terms, it was a necessary period of recovery for a body that had been traumatized. It allowed the torn tissues to heal and the mother to bond with the infant. This period ended with the churching of women, a ceremony where the woman was ritually purified and welcomed back into the congregation. It was a celebration of survival as much as a religious rite. The shadow of death hung over the nursery as well. Infant mortality was staggeringly high. Historians estimate that perhaps a quarter of all children died before their first birthday, and half died before reaching adulthood. This reality shaped the emotional landscape of the medieval family. Mothers and fathers loved their children deeply. The grief recorded in journals and letters is palpable and heartbreaking, but they also had to steel themselves against the likelihood of loss. A couple might have 10 children in the hopes that 3 would survive to inherit the land or the trade. This constant cycle of pregnancy, birth, and mourning took a toll on the bodies of women. A woman of 30 might look 50, her body depleted by repeated pregnancies and the relentless labor of the household. This biological imperative also shaped the darker side of intimacy, the double standard of adultery. In a society where bloodlines determined the transfer of land and titles, a woman's fidelity was paramount. If a man strayed, it was a sin, a moral failing that required confession, but it did not threaten the structure of society. If a woman strayed, it was treason against the family. She risked introducing a cuckoo into the nest, a child who had no blood right to the inheritance. Consequently, the punishments for female adultery were brutal. A noblewoman could be cast out, stripped of her dower, or locked in a convent for the rest of her life. In some regions and earlier periods, the law allowed a husband to kill an adulterous wife if caught in the act. The sexual liberty of men was tacitly accepted, with brothels often being legal, tax-paying establishments in medieval cities, run by the municipality or even the church, under the pragmatic guise that they prevented men from seducing honorable women. If the bedroom was a place of crowded discomfort, the medieval bathroom, or rather the lack of it, was a realm of grim necessity that shaped the daily reality of every man, woman, and child. To understand the intimate lives of people in the Middle Ages, one must confront the logistics of biological waste, for there was no escaping the smell. In the great stone castles that dotted the landscape, the bathroom was known as the garderobe. The name itself is telling. It translates to wardrobe or a place to keep clothes. This was not a euphemism, but a practical strategy. The garderobe was essentially a small, cold chamber jutting out from the castle wall, consisting of a wooden or stone bench with a hole in the center. The waste would fall down a long shaft, often emptying directly into the moat below or into a massive cesspit at the base of the tower. Medieval people quickly discovered that the pungent fumes rising from the shaft, heavy with ammonia, were deadly to fleas and moths. Therefore, they would hang their expensive wool coats and velvet cloaks in the toilet shaft. The stench that permeated the fabric was considered a small price to pay for protecting the garments from insect damage. Thus, the scent of the nobility was often a complex bouquet of rose water, sweat, and the faint, sharp tang of the latrine. For the user, the experience of the garderobe was far from private or comfortable. The seat was cold stone. In winter, the wind would whistle up the shaft, freezing the exposed skin. There were no S-bends or water traps to block the smells from below. In the summer, the heat would cook the waste in the cesspit, sending waves of nausea-inducing odor back up into the castle. Furthermore, these small rooms were rarely solitary. In larger palaces, garderobes were sometimes built with multiple seats side by side, allowing people to converse while relieving themselves. The concept of bathroom privacy is a largely modern invention. In the medieval world, bodily functions were simply another part of the communal existence. For the peasantry living in wattle and daub huts, the situation was more primitive, but perhaps more hygienic in its simplicity. They did not have indoor facilities. They used a cesspit dug in the yard, often near the vegetable garden, or simply the dung hill, a pile of waste, straw, and animal manure that stood outside every home. This waste was a valuable commodity. It was the fertilizer that kept the fields productive. However, the proximity of the waste to the water source was a constant, invisible killer. The same bucket used to fetch water from the well might be handled by hands that had just tended to the dunghill, creating a cycle of dysentery and worms that plagued the population. The act of cleaning oneself after the fact was a matter of available resources. There was, of course, no toilet paper. The wealthy might use pieces of old wool or linen cut into squares and kept in a basket. The less fortunate used what nature provided. Arsewisps, handfuls of straw, hay, or grass were the standard. In swampy areas, sphagnum moss was prized for its softness and absorbency. In coastal regions, mussel shells were sometimes used as scrapers, a method that makes the modern mind wince. The left hand was traditionally reserved for these cleaning tasks, while the right hand was used for eating and greeting, a cultural distinction that survives in many parts of the world today. This backdrop of hygiene, or the lack thereof, brings us to one of the most guarded and misunderstood aspects of medieval female life: menstruation. In the medical and religious texts of the time, the menstrual cycle was viewed with a mixture of fear, disgust, and superstition. It was known as the flowers, the terms, or the monthly courses. The Church Fathers, following the Levitical laws of the Old Testament, deemed a menstruating woman ritually unclean. She was often discouraged from taking communion during her cycle. Intimacy during this time was strictly forbidden. It was believed that a child conceived during menstruation would be born monstrous, possessed of red hair, a sign of the devil, deformed limbs, or a cruel nature. This belief persisted well into the Renaissance.
Medically, menstruation was seen as a purgative process. Since women were considered cold and moist compared to hot and dry men, their bodies could not burn off the excess humors and toxins through physical labor or heat. Therefore, they had to bleed to release these poisons. This view led to the belief that menstrual blood was a potent venom. Pliny the Elder, whose ancient texts were still revered in the Middle Ages, wrote that a menstruating woman could sour wine, dull mirrors, kill crops, and drive dogs mad simply by looking at them. This cultural stigma meant that women had to manage their cycles in deep secrecy and shame. The practicalities of this management were challenging. Medieval women did not wear underpants in the modern sense. The brays or breeches worn by men were considered masculine attire, and for a woman to wear them was sometimes seen as cross-dressing, a sin. Women wore long chemises, linen shifts under their dresses. So how did they manage the flow? They likely used a clout or a rag, pieces of linen folded over and held in place by a belt or a girdle worn around the waist under the dress. Some historical evidence suggests the use of bog moss packed into the rag for absorption,
as the moss has natural antiseptic properties. These rags would have to be washed, dried, and reused, a difficult task to keep secret in a household where privacy was non-existent. The term "on the rag" finds its grim literal origins here. The physical discomfort was exacerbated by the lack of analgesics. Cramps, bloating, and migraines were endured without aspirin. Women brewed teas of willow bark, which contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin, or motherwort to ease the pain, but the suffering was largely accepted as the curse of Eve, the price paid for the original sin in the Garden of Eden. Beyond the specific hygiene of the bathroom and the cycle, there was the constant itchy presence of parasites. Lice were not a sign of poverty, they were a fact of life. Everyone, from the king to the serf, had lice. They lived in the hair, in the seams of the clothing, and in the bedding. Delousing was a primary social activity within the family and between lovers. It was common to see a woman with a man's head in her lap, picking through his hair to crack the lice between her thumbnails. This grooming ritual was a form of intimacy in itself, a service performed for those you cared about. To combat the vermin, people used fine-toothed combs made of bone, wood, or ivory. These combs were often double-sided, one side for untangling hair, the other for dragging out nits, lice eggs. However, the heavy woolen clothing, which could rarely be washed without shrinking or felting, provided the perfect habitat for body lice. The bites left red, itchy welts on the skin, and the constant scratching could lead to skin infections like impetigo. The smell of unwashed bodies was often masked, but never truly removed. In such a world, the standards of beauty and attraction were different. A clean person was one whose hands and face were washed, and whose visible linen cuffs and collar were white. The state of the body underneath was largely ignored. When a medieval lover praised a woman's sweet breath, it was a high compliment because it was rare. Rotting teeth and gum disease were common. People chewed on fennel seeds, aniseed, or cloves to sweeten the breath. They rubbed their teeth with rough linen cloths dipped in salt or crushed herbs. But despite these efforts, the close-quarters intimacy of the era was an olfactory experience that would likely overwhelm a modern person. Yet humanity is adaptable. The people of the Middle Ages did not walk around in a constant state of disgust. This was the only world they knew. The darkness of the night was not empty, but filled with the breathing of family. And within this harsh, dirty, and regulated framework, people still fell in love. They still sought pleasure. They still found ways to connect. The church, however, was always watching, trying to regulate this connection. The clergy had a very specific hierarchy of sexual sins. At the top was the sin against nature, sodomy or bestiality. Then came adultery, violating another man's property. Then fornication, sex between unmarried people. But even in marriage there was a sin, the sin of lust. If a husband loved his wife too much, if he sought her out purely for pleasure and not for procreation, he was considered an adulterer in the eyes of God. Saint Jerome famously wrote that he who is too ardent a lover of his own wife is an adulterer. This theological trap meant that even the most sanctioned form of intimacy was laced with guilt. A couple enjoying each other's bodies was technically prioritizing the flesh over the spirit. This guilt gave rise to a complex relationship with concubines and mistresses. For powerful men, maintaining a mistress was a way to bypass the rigid transactional nature of noble marriage. A king or a duke married for land and alliances. He took a mistress for affection and pleasure. The church condemned this, of course, but often turned a blind eye if the man was discreet and continued to support the church financially. The children of these unions, the bastards, held a strange place in society. They could not inherit titles or land by right, but they were often acknowledged, educated, and given high positions in the army or the church. They were living proof of the sin, yet they were often cared for better than the legitimate children of the poor.
The regulation of intimacy in the Middle Ages was not limited to the private whispers of the confessional. It frequently spilled over into the cold, harsh light of the courtroom. In a society where marriage was the bedrock of economic and political stability, the physical mechanics of the union were a matter of public law. This brings us to one of the most bizarre and humiliating legal procedures in European history, the impotence trial, specifically the phenomenon known in late medieval France as the trial by Congress. In the eyes of the Church, a marriage that could not be consummated was not a marriage at all. It was a contract with an unfulfilled clause. If a wife claimed that her husband was unable to perform his duties, that he was impotent, she had grounds for an annulment. This was one of the few ways a woman could legally escape an unhappy marriage. However, the burden of proof was immense. The court required evidence, and in an era before modern medical diagnostics, the evidence had to be visual and functional. The process often began with a physical inspection. A panel of honest women, usually midwives or matrons of good standing, would be appointed by the court to examine the wife. Their task was to determine if she was still a virgin, virgo intacta. If they declared her untouched, the focus shifted to the husband. The court would then order an inspection of the man. Doctors and priests would examine his anatomy in a clinical setting, looking for obvious deformities or signs of coldness. They would measure, touch, and prod, often using icy water or other stimuli to test for a reaction. The humiliation for the man, standing naked before a panel of judging peers, was profound. If these initial inspections were inconclusive, if the man appeared healthy but the wife insisted he could not perform with her, the court might order the trial by Congress. This was exactly what it sounds like, a court-ordered attempt at intimacy. The couple would be sent to a neutral location, often a specific room in a bathhouse or a private home designated by the judge. They were not alone. Witnesses, usually the midwives and sometimes officers of the court, would be stationed in the room or just behind a thin partition. Their job was to listen and, at the critical moment, to visually verify the act. Imagine the psychological terror of this scenario. A husband and wife, likely already hating one another, forced to attempt the most intimate of acts on a strange bed, while a group of elderly matrons stood by with candles, waiting to judge the man's virility. The pressure almost guaranteed failure. If the man failed to perform, the marriage was declared null and void. The wife was free to remarry, and the man was often prohibited from marrying again, labeled publicly as unable to fulfill the duties of a husband. He was legally and socially unmanned. While the courts dealt with the failures of the flesh, the church dealt with the sins of the spirit. To understand the medieval mind, one must look at the penitentials. These were handbooks written for priests to help them navigate the complex world of sin during confession. In a time when the average village priest might be barely literate and poorly educated, these books provided a script. They listed every conceivable sin and assigned a specific penance, usually a number of days or years of fasting on bread and water. The penitentials reveal a church that was obsessed with the micromanagement of the bedroom.
The most famous of these, compiled by figures like Burchard of Worms, contain lists of questions that are shockingly graphic. The priest was instructed to ask the penitent specific details. Did you do it from behind? Did you do it standing? Did you use a device? Each variation carried a specific tariff. For example, using a position other than the standard one might incur 40 days of fasting. If a husband and wife had relations during Lent, the penalty might be a year of penance. These books also reveal the deep-seated superstitions of the time. There were specific penances for women who mixed their husband's semen with food to increase his love, a form of love magic, or for those who drank the urine of a hare to cure infertility. The Church was fighting a constant war not just against lust, but against a pagan undercurrent of folk magic that governed the peasantry's understanding of their own bodies. The calendar of abstinence mentioned earlier was enforced through these confessions. A pious couple was expected to abstain from intimacy on every Sunday in honor of the resurrection, every Wednesday and Friday, fast days, the 40 days of Lent, the 40 days before Christmas, Advent, the days following Pentecost, the feast days of the apostles and major saints, during the wife's menstruation, during pregnancy, for 40 days after childbirth. When you subtract all these dates, a couple was left with only a few dozen days a year when intimacy was religiously safe. Of course, human nature being what it is, these rules were widely flouted, but they created a pervasive atmosphere of guilt. Every act of passion was a potential roll of the dice with one's eternal soul. A child born with a clubfoot or a cleft lip was often viewed not as a genetic accident, but as a divine punishment for a Sunday conception or a violation of Lent. Yet, in this landscape of repression, there existed a massive, sanctioned industry of vice, prostitution. The medieval attitude toward prostitution was surprisingly pragmatic. It was heavily influenced by the writings of St. Augustine, who famously compared prostitutes to a sewer in a palace. He argued that while a sewer is filthy and smells foul, if you remove it, the entire palace becomes filled with filth. Similarly, the Church Fathers believed that if you removed prostitutes from society, the unbridled lust of men would destroy honorable women. Prostitution was seen as a necessary evil, a pressure valve that protected the sanctity of marriage by giving men a place to discharge their excess heat. As a result, brothels were not only legal in many medieval cities, they were often owned and regulated by the municipality or the church itself. In London, the famous brothels of Southwark were located on land owned by the Bishop of Winchester. The prostitutes were colloquially known as Winchester geese. These establishments, known as stews, bathhouses, were highly regulated. The regulations, or ordinances, for the stews give us a grim picture of the life of a medieval sex worker. The women were often forbidden from wearing the apron of a respectable woman or the veil. They had to wear distinctive clothing, often a striped hood or a specific color of dress, so that no honest man would mistake them for a wife. They were forbidden from spinning wool or doing other honest work while in the brothel, effectively trapping them in their trade. They were not allowed to have lovers or pimps who took their money. The stew holder, brothel keeper, was the only authority. The life of these women was brutal and short. Most were drawn from the ranks of the desperate, widows, runaway serfs, or victims of assault who had been cast out by their families. Once they entered the district, they They were often trapped by debt to the stewholder, who charged them exorbitant rates for food, room, and clothing. Disease was rampant. Syphilis would not arrive in Europe until the end of the 15th century, brought back from the Americas, but gonorrhea, known as the burning, and other infections were common. A woman who became too sick to work was often cast out into the street to beg. There was a final cruel irony for the Winchester geese. Although they worked on the bishop's land and their earnings helped fill the church's coffers, they were denied Christian burial. They lived in the shadow of the church but were barred from its salvation. They were buried in unconsecrated ground in a cemetery known as Crossbones, a plot of earth packed with the skeletons of thousands of women and unwanted infants who were deemed too sinful for the grace of God. Between the terrified couple in the courtroom, the whispering penitent in the confessional, and the striped-hooded woman in the stews, the reality of medieval intimacy was a far cry from the high romance of Arthurian legend. It was a world where the body was a battleground, fought over by the demands of nature, the laws of man, and the fear of God. And yet, there were other dangers lurking in the shadows of the bedroom, dangers that were neither legal nor spiritual, but purely medical. The medieval understanding of anatomy was a landscape of guesses and metaphors. This brings us to the terrifying reality of medieval contraception and the science of the womb, where the cure was often deadlier than the condition. The medieval bedroom was not only a courtroom and a confessional, it was also a laboratory of ignorance. To comprehend the suffering and confusion that defined intimate life in this era, one must confront the absolute darkness of medical knowledge regarding the human body. Physicians, trained in the universities of Paris or Bologna, did not study anatomy by dissecting bodies. That was largely forbidden by religious taboo until the later Middle Ages. Instead, they studied ancient texts. They read Galen and Aristotle, repeating errors that had been written down 1,000 years prior. This reliance on ancient authority over observation led to one of the most bizarre and persistent medical myths in history, the theory of the wandering womb. The uterus was not viewed simply as an organ. In the medieval imagination, it was possessed of a strange, semi-independent agency. Doctors believed it was like a living creature, a wild animal trapped within the female body that craved moisture and the seed of a man. If a woman remained celibate for too long, or if the womb was not satisfied by pregnancy, it was believed that the organ would become light and dry. It would then detach from its moorings and roam around the body in search of moisture. This wandering organ was blamed for almost every female ailment. If the womb moved upward toward the diaphragm, it was thought to crush the lungs, causing breathlessness and palpitations. If it moved to the throat, it caused choking, a sensation famously described as the globus hystericus. If it migrated to the head, it caused migraines and madness. The word hysteria itself comes from the Greek word hystera, meaning uterus. Thus, any emotional outburst, anxiety, or physical weakness in a woman was diagnosed as her womb traveling to the wrong place. The treatments for this condition were as grim as they were illogical. To coax the animal back to its proper place, doctors used a system of smells. They believed the womb fled from bad smells and was attracted to sweet ones. Therefore, if the womb had risen to the throat, causing choking, the doctor would hold foul-smelling substances under the woman's nose, burnt feathers, sulfur, or extinguished coal. Simultaneously, they would scent the woman's lower regions with sweet perfumes, musk and rosewater, hoping to lure the organ back down. This was the medical reality for women. Their bodies were treated as battlegrounds between chaotic internal forces, managed by men holding burnt feathers to their faces. This ignorance extended to the very nature of conception. While the Church preached that the sole purpose of intimacy was procreation, the mechanics of how life began were a mystery. Many medieval thinkers believed in the theory of the homunculus. They thought that the man seed contained a fully formed, microscopic human being. The woman's body was merely the soil in which this seed was planted. She provided the incubator, but not the essential spark of life. This view reinforced the patriarchal structure of society. If the man provided the life and the woman was just the vessel, then the child belonged entirely to the father's bloodline. It was a biological justification for the erasure of women from the lineage. However, when the seed was spilled without the possibility of procreation, the medieval world ceased to be merely confused and became violently punitive. This brings us to the sin against nature, a category of crime that included sodomy. In the Middle Ages, sodomy was a broad legal term. It did not refer exclusively to homosexuality. It covered any sexual act that could not result in reproduction. This included oral relations, anal relations, and sometimes even solitary acts. These were not just sins, they were capital crimes. The fear of sodomy was linked to the fear of social collapse. Medieval people believed that if such unnatural acts were tolerated, God would punish the entire community with plague, famine, or earthquake, just as he had destroyed the biblical cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Therefore, the persecution of those accused of these acts was a matter of public safety. The punishment was often death by burning. The logic was symbolic. Fire was a purifying element, consuming the flesh that had been polluted by the sin, leaving nothing behind to contaminate the earth. The most famous example of this hysteria occurred in the early 14th century with the trial of the Knights Templar. When King Philip IV of France wished to destroy this powerful military order to seize their wealth, he did not accuse them of incompetence or cowardice. He accused them of the sin against nature. The Templars were tortured until they confessed to initiating new recruits with unnatural kisses and engaging in illicit acts in the darkness of their dormitories. These confessions, extracted under the agony of the rack and the strappado, were used to justify the burning of dozens of knights at the stake. It was a grim lesson to the populace. An accusation of sexual deviancy was a weapon that could destroy even the most powerful men in Christendom. Yet, amidst these horrors, there are myths that need to be dispelled. The most enduring of these is the chastity belt. The image of a medieval knight locking his wife in a metal contraption before riding off to the Crusades is a staple of cartoons and bad movies. However, historians have found almost no evidence that such devices existed in the Middle Ages. The iron belts displayed in museums are almost all forgeries from the 18th and 19th centuries, created to titillate Victorian audiences who wanted to believe in the barbarity of their ancestors. In reality, a woman locked in a metal device in the unhygienic conditions of the Middle Ages would have died within days from sepsis caused by the metal chafing the skin and the accumulation of waste. The chastity belt of the Middle Ages was not made of iron, it was made of social pressure, the watchful eye of the mother-in-law, and the terrifying threat of hell. There was, however, a very real and physical barrier to intimacy that plagued the medieval population, the codified system of consanguinity. The Church had incredibly strict rules about incest, but their definition of incest was so broad it paralyzed rural communities. For a long time, the Church forbade marriage between anyone related within 7 degrees of consanguinity. This meant you could not marry anyone who shared a great-great-great-great-great-grandparent with you. In a small medieval village where families had lived and intermarried for centuries, this effectively meant you were related to everyone. To navigate this, the peasantry often ignored the rules until a disaster struck. If a crop failed or a child died, the village priest might decide it was because John and Mary were 4th cousins and God was punishing their incestuous union. The marriage could be annulled and the children declared bastards. For the nobility, these rules were a convenient political tool. A king who wanted to get rid of his queen didn't need a divorce, which was impossible. He just needed a genealogist to prove that he and his wife shared a distant ancestor. Suddenly, the marriage was invalid, and he was free to marry a younger woman. It was a loophole the size of a kingdom, turning the sacred bond of marriage into a temporary arrangement subject to the drawing of a family tree. The shadow of the Church loomed largest, however, over the double monasteries and the problem of celibacy. We often think of monks and nuns living in separate worlds, but in the early Middle Ages there were double monasteries, communities where monks and nuns lived in adjacent buildings, often ruled by a single abbess. The proximity of men and women, all sworn to celibacy, yet living within shouting distance, created an environment rife with tension and scandal. Archaeological excavations at some of these sites have revealed the grim reality hidden behind the cloistered walls. In the latrines of some convents, researchers have found the tiny skeletons of fetuses. These tragic discoveries point to the desperate measures taken by nuns who fell from grace. A pregnancy in a convent was a catastrophe. It was not just a sin, it was a violation of the Bride of Christ status. A nun found to have broken her vows could be subjected to severe penance, imprisonment in a dark cell for years, or, in the most extreme legends, though rarely verified, immured, walled up alive. The fear of female sexuality within the Church was so intense that it led to the architecture of segregation. In churches, women were often required to stand on the north side, the side of darkness and the Old Testament, while men stood on the south side, the side of light and the New Testament. Women were forbidden from entering the sanctuary near the altar during the Mass. They were considered a source of pollution. A menstruating woman who touched the altar cloth would require the cloth to be burned. This fear of pollution extended to the succubus and incubus. Medieval people lived in a world where demons were as real as wolves. They believed that demons could take physical form to steal human seed. A man who woke up with a wet dream did not attribute it to biology. He believed he had been visited by a succubus, a female demon who seduced men in their sleep to harvest their seed. This seed would then be transferred to an incubus, a male demon, to impregnate a sleeping woman. This convoluted supernatural theory was used to explain why a virtuous woman might become pregnant while her husband was away, or why a nun might find herself with child. It was a terrifying worldview where one was not safe even in sleep, where the devil could slide between the sheets and steal the essence of life. Thus, the medieval night was filled with terrors, the fear of the wandering womb, the fear of the deadly sin of sodomy, the fear of incestuous bloodlines, and the fear of demonic assault. It is a wonder, then, that amidst this minefield of medical horror and theological guilt, the human drive for connection survived at all. But it survived. In the margins of manuscripts, in the lyrics of bawdy songs, and in the court records of lovers caught in the act, we see that the human spirit and the human body remained defiant.
If the medieval medical world was a landscape of terror, the world of medieval beauty was a theater of slow poisoning. In a society where life was short and often brutal, the desire to preserve youth and capture affection led men and women down dark chemical paths. To look upon the face of a medieval noblewoman was often to look upon a mask of heavy minerals that were silently killing her from the inside out. The ideal of beauty in the Middle Ages was rigid and unforgiving. A woman was expected to have a high forehead, a long neck, and skin as pale and translucent as a lily. This pallor was a status symbol, a visual declaration that she did not labor in the fields under the harsh sun like a peasant. But nature rarely grants such ghostly whiteness, and so artifice stepped in with deadly consequences. The most popular foundation of the era, which would persist for centuries, was a substance known as Venetian ceruse, or spirits of Saturn. The recipe was deceptively simple. Rigid plates of lead were suspended over pots of vinegar. The chemical reaction turned the lead into a white flaky powder, basic lead carbonate. This powder, when mixed with water or oil, created a thick, opaque white paint that covered every blemish, every pockmark from smallpox, and every freckle. It gave the skin a smooth, porcelain finish that was irresistible to the eye. But lead is a heavy metal neurotoxin. When applied to the skin daily, it was absorbed into the bloodstream. The side effects were a grim catalogue of decay. At first, the skin would dry out and crack. Then it would turn gray and shriveled, a condition ironically requiring more of the thick white paint to conceal the damage it had caused. Over time, the lead poisoning would attack the gums, causing them to blacken and recede. It would cause the teeth to loosen and fall out. Eventually, it attacked the mind. Mood swings, memory loss, and paralysis were common among the high-born ladies who plastered their faces with this lethal cosmetic. They were literally dying for beauty, their internal organs shutting down while their faces remained frozen in a mask of white perfection. The eyes were another site of dangerous experimentation. To achieve a look of wide-eyed innocence and arousal, women used drops from the plant Atropa belladonna. The name belladonna means beautiful lady in Italian, a nod to its cosmetic use. The plant contains atropine, which forces the pupils to dilate, making the eyes appear large, dark, and watery. It was considered incredibly alluring. However, belladonna is better known by its other name, deadly nightshade. Prolonged use of these drops caused blurred vision, sensitivity to light, and eventually permanent blindness. It was a high price to pay for a seductive gaze. The pursuit of the fashionable high forehead led to equally painful rituals. A low hairline was considered rustic and animalistic. To achieve the elegant domed look of the nobility, women would pluck the hair from their front hairline, sometimes receding it by an inch or more. They would also pluck their eyebrows until they were barely visible thin lines, or remove them entirely. To prevent the hair from growing back, they applied caustic substances. Recipes from the time suggest pastes made of quicklime and arsenic, or poultices of vinegar mixed with cat dung. These mixtures would burn the skin, destroying the hair follicles and leaving the forehead red and raw,
which then, of course, had to be covered with more white lead paint. But what if beauty was not enough? In a world where marriages were arranged and emotional connection was often absent, people turned to the dark arts of the love potion. The apothecary and the local wise woman did a brisk trade in aphrodisiacs and philters designed to entrap a lover's heart or reignite the passion of a cooling husband. The ingredients of these potions reveal a desperate reliance on sympathic magic, the belief that like cures like. The most infamous of these substances was Spanish fly. It sounds exotic, but it is actually a powder made from crushed blister beetles, Lyta vesicaria. When ingested, the cantharidin in the beetles causes severe irritation and inflammation of the urinary tract. This swelling mimics the physical sensations of arousal, but it is in fact a toxic reaction. It is not an aphrodisiac, it is a poison. An overdose of Spanish fly could cause kidney failure, internal bleeding, and a slow, agonizing death. Yet it was secretly slipped into cups of spiced wine at banquets, a dangerous game of chemical roulette played in the name of lust. Other love potions were far more personal and grotesque. A common belief was that to make someone love you, they had to ingest a part of you. This led to the baking of love cakes. A woman might mix her own menstrual blood, breast milk, or even sweat into the dough of a cake or bread and serve it to the object of her desire. There are court records of women being put on trial for witchcraft after feeding their husbands food laced with these bodily fluids. In one grim case, a woman was accused of feeding her husband bread that she had kept tucked in her armpit for days to soak up her scent and sweat. For men seeking to cure impotence or increase their virility, the remedies were equally bizarre. They were prescribed the testicles of animals known for their stamina, bulls, goats, or roosters, often eaten raw or dried and ground into powder. The root of the mandrake plant, which looks vaguely like a human figure, was highly valued. Legend said that the mandrake shrieked when pulled from the earth, a sound that could kill a man, so dogs were used to uproot them. The root was then slept with, bathed, and treated like a child, believed to bring fertility and sexual power to the household. The church, naturally, viewed all of this, the makeup, the plucking, and the potions, with deep hostility. To a medieval priest, a woman painting her face was committing a sin of pride and deception. She was dissatisfied with the face God had given her and was presuming to improve upon the Creator's work. A famous sermon from the era warned women that at the Last Judgment, God would not recognize them because they had covered their true faces with the devil's mask. Makeup was seen as the badge of the prostitute, a snare set to trap men's souls. This religious condemnation created a strange paradox. A noble woman was expected to be beautiful to honor her husband and her station, yet the methods required to achieve that beauty were sinful. She had to navigate a narrow path. She must look perfect, but she must not look like she tried. She must be alluring enough to produce heirs, but not so alluring that she incited lust. And then there was the smell. We have spoken of the lack of bathing, but the masking of odors was an art form in itself. The wealthy carried pomanders, perforated balls of gold or silver filled with ambergris, musk, and cloves. They held these to their noses when walking through the crowded, stinking streets, or when conversing with someone's breath was foul. But the most expensive perfumes contained ingredients that were surprisingly visceral. Musk comes from the gland of a deer. Ambergris is a waxy substance regurgitated by sperm whales. Civet is the secretion from the anal glands of the civet cat. These heavy animalistic scents were layered over the smell of unwashed bodies, creating a thick, musky atmosphere in the great halls, a scent of sweat, rot, rosewater, and anal secretions that defined the olfactory landscape of the Middle Ages. Even the hair on one's head was a battleground. Lice were not the only problem. The fashion for elaborate headdresses, the hennin, cone-shaped hat, or the horned wimple, meant the hair had to be tightly bound and hidden. Women would plait their hair with ribbons and wires to create complex structures, but washing this hair was an ordeal. A mixture of ash, egg whites, and soakwort might be used, but drying thigh-length hair by a smoky fire took hours. Consequently, hair was washed rarely. To clean it, women would use a dry shampoo of powdered starch or bran, combed through to absorb the grease. Over months, the accumulation of starch, grease, and sweat could form a crust on the scalp, a breeding ground for ringworm and fungal infections that flourished beneath the silken veils of the aristocracy. The grim reality of medieval beauty was that it was a facade built on pain and poison. The pale face of the lady in the tapestry, staring out with serene eyes, was likely a face burning from chemical peels, a mouth aching from rot, and a body slowly failing from lead toxicity. It was a world where the surface was everything, because the reality underneath was too harsh to bear. To survive the Middle Ages was to engage in a daily battle with one's own stomach. In a world without refrigeration, preservatives, or the germ theory of disease, every meal was a calculated risk. The history of medieval food is not merely a catalog of roasted boars and flowing wine as depicted in the banquets of Hollywood. It is a story of grit, rot, and a microscopic fungus that could turn an entire village into a hallucinating, limb-losing purgatory. Let us begin with the absolute staple of existence, bread. It was the fuel of the medieval engine, consuming between 60% and 70% of the daily caloric intake for the average person. But this was not the soft, white, sliced loaf of the modern supermarket. The bread of the peasantry was dark, heavy, and coarse. It was made from rye, barley, or maslin, a mixture of wheat and rye. The texture was formidable. This was due in part to the milling process. The grain was ground between massive stone wheels. Over time, these stones would grind against each other, shedding fine grit and sand into the flour. This invisible ingredient defined the dental health of the population. While sugar was rare and cavities were fewer, the stone grit in the bread acted like sandpaper. Over the decades, it slowly ground down the crowns of the teeth, wearing them flat, sometimes exposing the nerve. If you look at the skulls of medieval adults, the teeth are often worn down to nubbins. This constant abrasion made chewing painful and led to abscesses that could spread infection to the jaw and the brain, killing the eater simply because they tried to sustain themselves. But the grain held a darker secret than sand. In wet, cool summers, the rye crops were susceptible to a fungus called Claviceps purpurea, known as ergot. To the medieval farmer, the infected grain looked slightly enlarged and black, like a spur on a rooster's leg. They did not know it was poison. They ground it into flour and baked it into bread. The result was a horrific condition known as ergotism, or by its more terrified medieval name, St. Anthony's fire. The symptoms were nightmarish. The fungus contains alkaloids similar to LSD. The first sign was often a terrifying hallucination. Victims would see demons, hellfire, or monsters attacking them. Entire families or villages, having eaten from the same batch of flour, would descend into a shared madness. Then came the physical agony. The poison caused extreme vasoconstriction. The blood vessels clamped shut, cutting off circulation to the extremities. Victims described a sensation of intense, burning heat in their limbs, as if they were being roasted alive, hence the name fire. As the blood flow ceased, gangrene set in. Toes, fingers, hands, and feet would turn black, shrivel, and eventually fall off. It was a dry, bloodless amputation. There are chronicles of peasants walking to shrines to pray for a cure, carrying their own detached limbs in baskets. It was a plague of bread, a betrayal of the most basic foodstuff, and for centuries no one understood why it happened. They believed it was the wrath of God. For those who avoided the poisoned bread, the menu was dominated by pottage. This was the universal dish of the poor, a thick soup or stew that simmered constantly over the hearth fire. It was the original perpetual stew. The pot was rarely emptied or scrubbed. New ingredients were simply added to the remnants of yesterday's meal. On a good day, it might contain onions, peas, cabbage, and a scrap of bacon or salt pork. On a bad day, it was watery gruel. The reliance on salted and preserved meats was a necessity of the seasons. In the autumn, when the grass stopped growing, farmers could not afford to feed their livestock through the winter. This led to the Martinsmas slaughter in November, where pigs and cows were butchered en masse. The meat had to last until spring. It was packed in barrels of salt, smoked in chimneys, or dried in the wind. By February or March, the meat was often rancid, tough, and gray. This is where spices entered the equation for the wealthy. We often hear that spices were used to mask the taste of rotting meat. While partly true, spices were also a supreme status symbol. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg had to travel thousands of miles from the east, passing through the hands of Arab traders and Venetian merchants, each taking a cut. A pound of nutmeg could cost as much as a cow. To serve a dish heavily spiced was essentially to eat money. It showed your guests that you commanded the resources of the known world. The wealthy also indulged in subtleties, elaborate food sculptures made of marzipan or sugar paste, shaped like castles, ships, or saints, designed to be admired rather than eaten, a display of conspicuous consumption, while the poor outside gnawed on gritty rye. Then there was the question of hydration. There is a persistent myth that medieval people never drank water because it was deadly. This is an exaggeration. People did drink water from pristine springs or deep wells. However, in the growing towns and cities, water was indeed a gamble. Tanners dumped toxic chemicals into the rivers, butchers threw offal into the streams, and cesspits leaked into the groundwater. The solution was ale. It was the hydration of choice for everyone, men, women, and children. But this was not the high-alcohol craft beer of today. It was often a small beer, brewed with the second or third running of the grain, resulting in a drink with a very low alcohol content, perhaps 1% or 2%. It was thick, cloudy, and full of calories. It was safer than water because the brewing process involved boiling, which killed the bacteria. A medieval laborer might drink a gallon of ale a day just to maintain his energy levels. Monks in monasteries were allocated vast quantities of ale as part of their daily rations. It was food in liquid form. The diet was also strictly policed by the church. The calendar was a minefield of fasting days. On Fridays, during Lent, and on the eves of major holidays, the consumption of flesh meat, warm-blooded land animals was forbidden. This restriction sparked a creative, if somewhat dishonest, taxonomy of food. Desperate to eat something substantial, medieval minds began to classify animals in convenient ways. The beaver, for instance, was a prize target. It was an aquatic animal with a scaly, flat tail. Therefore, the church authorities often decided that the beaver's tail was fish, not meat. This allowed monks and nobles to feast on roast beaver tail during Lent without imperiling their souls. Similarly, the barnacle goose was the subject of a bizarre biological myth. People had never seen the geese nest as they migrated to the Arctic to breed, but they had seen barnacles on driftwood that looked vaguely like small birds. They concluded that the geese hatched from the barnacles, which grew in the sea. Therefore, the goose was a fish, or at least a fruit of the sea, and could be eaten on Fridays. It was a loophole born of hunger and theological gymnastics. Table manners were another arena of grim reality. There were no forks. The fork was considered a decadent, effeminate Italian invention that looked suspiciously like the devil's pitchfork. It would not become common in Northern Europe until the 16th or 17th century. People ate with their fingers and a spoon. They used their own knives, which they carried on their belts, the same knives used to cut wood, skin animals, or defend themselves. Meals were served on trenchers, slices of stale, hard bread that acted as plates. The trenchers would soak up the juices and grease of the stew. At the end of the meal, the wealthy would give their gravy-soaked trenchers to the dogs or distribute them as alms to the poor waiting at the gate. To eat one's own trencher was a sign of desperate hunger. Communal dining meant communal germs. A cup was often passed around the table, shared by everyone. The salt cellar sat in the middle of the table, separating the guests of honor, who sat above the salt, from the lower status retainers, who sat below the salt. You reached into the serving dish with your hands. Manners books from the era give us a clue as to how gross the reality must have been by listing the things one should not do. Do not spit on the table. Do not pick your teeth with your knife. Do not blow your nose into the tablecloth. And do not pet the dog and then touch the food. The fact that these rules had to be written down suggests that these behaviors were commonplace. But perhaps the greatest terror of the medieval digestive system was not what went in, but what failed to come out. Constipation was a chronic issue, likely due to a diet heavy in bread and salted meats, but low in fresh vegetables and hydration. The medical treatments for a blocked bowel were aggressive. Clysters or enemas were the standard remedy. The apothecary would use a clyster syringe, a large metal or bone piston, to inject fluids into the patient's rectum. The mixtures were concoctions of brine, honey, chamomile, and sometimes boar's bile. It was a humiliating and painful procedure, performed not in a hospital, but in the bedroom. For the king, this was a matter of state. The groom of the stool was a high-ranking courtier whose specific job was to assist the king with his toileting needs, monitoring the royal bowel movements as a barometer of the nation's health. It was a position of immense power, for the man who wiped the king's bottom was the man who heard the king's most private secrets. In times of famine, which struck with terrifying regularity, the social contract collapsed entirely. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was a microscopic ice age where it rained for months on end. The crops rotted in the fields, the salt turned to brine in the barrels, the animals died of murrain. The chronicles of this time read like a horror story. People ate their plow horses, then they ate the dogs and cats, then they ate the rats, then they ate the moss off the trees and the straw from the roofs. Finally, the whispers began, dark rumors of graves being disturbed, and children disappearing in the woods. While cannibalism was a supreme taboo, the archaeological evidence suggests that in the extremities of starvation, the line between human and animal dissolved. This was the precarious nature of medieval life. You were only ever one bad harvest away from eating grass, one batch of bad rye away from losing your feet to the holy fire, and one tooth crack away from a fatal infection. The banquet hall might have been hung with tapestries, but the plate in front of you was a battlefield.
In the modern world, death is sanitized. It takes place behind the closed doors of hospitals and funeral homes, managed by professionals who whisper in hushed tones. The body is whisked away, preserved, painted, and briefly displayed before disappearing into the earth or the fire. But in the Middle Ages, death was not a stranger to be hidden. It was a neighbor. It sat at the dinner table. It walked the streets. It was the most public and inevitable fact of life, woven into the very architecture of the towns and the rhythm of the days. To understand the medieval mindset, one must listen for the sound of the bell. In every parish, the church bell tolling was the soundtrack of mortality. It rang to announce a passing, a distinct pattern of peals that told the villagers not just that someone had died, but who, a man, a woman, or a child. This passing bell was a call to prayer, a reminder that another soul was facing the perilous journey through purgatory. The concept of the good death, ars moriendi, was central to medieval anxiety. A good death was not necessarily a painless one, nor was it a sudden one. In fact, sudden death was the ultimate terror. To die in one's sleep or to drop dead in the field was considered a spiritual catastrophe because it allowed no time for the final rites. Without the chance to confess sins, receive the Eucharist, and be anointed with holy oil, the soul was left vulnerable to the fires of hell. Therefore, the ideal death took place in bed, surrounded by family, neighbors, and the priest. It was a public performance of piety. The dying person was expected to make a final confession, forgive their enemies, and dispense their goods in a will that often included charitable donations to the church to fast-track their soul through the afterlife. But once the soul had departed, the grim reality of the body remained. The treatment of the corpse in the Middle Ages was dictated by a mixture of deep reverence and shocking pragmatism. In a typical village, the churchyard was the center of social life. It was not the quiet, manicured garden of stone we imagine today. It was a chaotic, mud-churned patch of earth. Because the ground was consecrated, holy, everyone wanted to be buried there, but space was finite, and the dead kept coming. This led to a cycle of recycling graves that would horrify modern sensibilities. A plot of land was not bought for eternity, it was leased for a duration of decomposition. After a few years or decades, when the flesh had rotted away and space was needed for a new body, the gravedigger would open the earth. The old bones would be exhumed. The skull and long bones, the femur and tibia, were considered the most durable and significant parts of the skeleton. These were collected and stacked neatly in a structure known as a charnel house or ossuary, usually located in the corner of the churchyard or in the crypt beneath the church. The charnel house was an open display of mortality. Villagers walking to Sunday Mass would pass by great stacks of thigh bones and pyramids of skulls, the remains of their grandfathers and neighbors.
It was a visual lesson in the equality of death. In the pile of bones, the skull of the Lord looked exactly like the skull of the serf. There was no gold, no velvet, no title, only calcium. This proximity to the physical remnants of the dead created a culture that was not morbid, but matter-of-fact. Children played among the graves, markets were sometimes held in the churchyard, and livestock grazed on the grass that grew from the ancestors. For the wealthy, however, there was an attempt to maintain status even in decay. This gave rise to one of the most grotesque forms of funerary art, the cadaver tomb, or transy. Unlike the traditional effigies that showed the deceased as they looked in the prime of life, sleeping peacefully in armor or fine robes, the cadaver tomb depicted the body as it looked in the grave. Carved in stone with shocking anatomical precision, these statues showed shriveled skin, rib cages protruding through rotting flesh, and worms crawling in and out of eye sockets. The inscription often carried a chilling warning to the viewer, "As I am, so shall you be." These were aggressive reminders of memento mori, remember that you will die. The purpose was to shock the living into prayer, to remind the wealthy heir staring at his father's tomb that his gold could not save him from the worm. The fear of what lay beyond the grave was monetized by the Church through the system of indulgences and purgatory. Purgatory was a third place, a temporary hell, where the souls of the saved were purged of their sins by fire before entering heaven. The duration of this suffering could be thousands of years, but it could be shortened by the prayers of the living. This created a massive economy of death. The wealthy founded chantries, private chapels where priests were paid to do nothing but sing masses for the soul of the donor, day after day, year after year. A rich merchant might pay for 10,000 masses to be said after his death, a desperate attempt to bribe his way out of the fire. The poor, who could afford no such insurance, relied on the collective prayers of the parish and the mercy of God. But not everyone was allowed into the holy ground of the churchyard. The exclusion from burial was a powerful weapon of social control. Suicides were considered guilty of self-murder, a crime against God, who gave life, and the king, who owned the subject. The body of a suicide was often subjected to further indignities. In England, it was common practice to bury a suicide at a crossroads, a place of traffic and confusion, sometimes with a wooden stake driven through the heart to pin the spirit to the ground and prevent it from wandering. Their property was confiscated by the crown, leaving their family destitute. It was a final, brutal punishment that extended beyond death. Unbaptized infants also posed a theological nightmare. Since they had not been cleansed of original sin, they could not enter heaven, but they had committed no personal sins to deserve hell. The Church created the concept of limbo for them, a place of natural happiness but separation from God. However, they could not be buried in the consecrated ground of the churchyard. They were often buried in the shady side of the church, near the north wall, or in unconsecrated ground just outside the fence. For a grieving mother, the pain of losing a child was compounded by the fear that she would never see them again in the afterlife. This structured, ritualized approach to death collapsed entirely in 1347 with the arrival of the Black Death. The plague was a trauma that rewrote the rules of dying. The sheer scale of the mortality, killing perhaps half the population of Europe, meant that the good death became impossible. There were not enough priests to hear confessions. There were not enough bells to toll. There were not enough coffins. The chronicles of the plague years described a descent into chaos. The dead were no longer individuals. They were refuse. Giant trenches were dug on the outskirts of towns. Bodies were stacked in layers, as lasagna, as one chronicler grimly noted, with a thin layer of earth between each layer of corpses. The smell of death hung over the cities like a fog. The fear of infection meant that families abandoned their sick. Parents left children. Husbands left wives. The deep ancestral bond of caring for the dying was severed by the panic of the pestilence. This trauma birthed the artistic motif of the danse macabre, the dance of death. Painted on the walls of churches and cemeteries, it showed a line of skeletons dancing with the living. A skeleton leads a pope, a king, a merchant, and a peasant towards the grave. The message was cynical and clear. Death is the great equalizer. It does not care about your money, your holiness, or your poverty. The plague had proven that the prayer of the monk offered no more protection than the shovel of the laborer. Yet even in death, the medieval body had value. This brings us to the obsession with relics. The bodies of saints were believed to contain a residue of divine power, a finger bone of St. Peter, a vial of blood from a martyr, or a tooth of the Virgin Mary were the most valuable objects in Christendom. They were economic engines. A town that possessed a major relic became a pilgrimage destination, bringing in thousands of travelers and their money. This demand led to a dark market of theft and forgery. Monks from rival monasteries would steal relics from each other, justifying the theft by claiming the saint wanted to move. Translation was the polite word for body snatching. There were likely enough pieces of the true cross circulating in Europe to build a ship, and enough milk of the Virgin Mary to fill a barrel. But the authenticity mattered less than the belief. People would travel hundreds of miles, walking on ulcerated feet, just to touch a reliquary containing a fragment of bone, hoping for a cure of their blindness or their cancer. It was a tangible connection to the divine in a world of physical suffering. The grim reality of the medieval grave was that it was never truly quiet. It was a busy, crowded, and contested space. Whether it was the gravedigger churning up the ancestors, the priest singing for wages, the thief stealing a ring from a corpse, or the desperate mother burying her unbaptized child by moonlight outside the fence, death was an active participant in the daily struggle of the Middle Ages. In the modern world, justice is a bureaucratic machine of lawyers, evidence, and forensic science. In the Middle Ages, justice was a theater of pain and divine intervention. There was no police force to investigate crimes, no fingerprinting to identify suspects, and no prison system designed for rehabilitation. Instead, the medieval legal system operated on a simple, terrifying premise. Truth was not found through investigation, but through the body. If a man was guilty, his body could be broken to reveal the sin. If he was innocent, God would intervene to protect his flesh. This belief gave rise to the trial by ordeal, a judicial method that baffles the modern mind, but possessed a perfect internal logic to the medieval peasant. The ordeal by fire was reserved for serious crimes. The accused was brought into the church, where a piece of iron weighing 1 to 3 pounds was heating in a brazier until it glowed red. After a solemn mass, the accused had to pick up the red-hot iron and carry it a specific distance, usually 9 feet. His hands were then bandaged and sealed by the priest. 3 days later, the bandages were removed. If the hand was healing cleanly, it was a sign of divine favor, and the man was innocent. If the wound was festering or infected, it was a sign of guilt. In a world without antibiotics, where burn wounds easily became septic, the verdict was almost always guilty. The ordeal by water followed a similar spiritual logic, but with a different element. The accused, often bound hand and foot, was thrown into a consecrated pool of water. The belief was that water, being a pure element used in baptism, would accept the innocent but reject the guilty. Therefore, if the accused sank, they were innocent, and hopefully hauled up by a rope before they drowned. If they floated, the water was rejecting them, proving their guilt. This method was particularly popular in cases of witchcraft, based on the idea that a witch had renounced their baptism, and thus the water would literally spit them out. When the ordeals were phased out by the Church in 1215, they were replaced by a legal system that relied heavily on confession. But in the absence of hard evidence, a confession had to be extracted. This brings us to the grim science of judicial torture. It is important to note that torture was not usually a punishment in itself. It was a procedural tool, a method of interrogation codified by law. The rack is the most infamous device. It was a wooden frame with rollers at each end. The victim's wrists and ankles were tied to the rollers, which were then turned with ratchets. The tension would stretch the body, dislocating joints and tearing muscles with a sickening popping sound. The questioner would sit calmly by the side, recording the answers. The goal was not to kill. A dead man cannot confess, but to bring the victim to the absolute edge of endurance, where the truth, or whatever the torturer wanted to hear, would spill out.
Once guilt was established, punishment followed. Medieval prisons were not correctional facilities, they were holding pens. Keeping a prisoner fed and guarded was expensive, so the state preferred punishments that were cheap, public, and permanent. The oubliette, from the French oublier, to forget, was the ultimate expression of this. It was a bottle-shaped dungeon, accessible only through a trapdoor in the ceiling. The prisoner was lowered or thrown down and simply left in the dark, often amidst the bones of previous occupants and the scuttling of rats. For lesser crimes, the punishment was designed to shame. The stocks and the pillory were staples of the village square. The criminal was locked in a wooden frame by their neck and wrists, unable to move or defend themselves. They became a target for the community's rage and ridicule. Passers-by would throw rotten vegetables, dead cats, stones, and human waste at the trapped victim. But the real danger was not the filth, it was the mob. If the crowd was particularly angry, a person in the pillory could be stoned to death or maimed before their sentence was up. For thieves and liars, the law wrote its sentence on the body itself. Mutilation was common. A thief might have a hand cut off or an ear cropped. A gossiping woman or a blasphemer might have their tongue bored through with a hot iron. Branding was a standard practice, turning the skin into a criminal record. A letter was burned into the thumb or the cheek, M for malefactor, T for thief. These scars ensured that the criminal could never hide their past. They carried their history on their face, forever excluded from honest society. Capital punishment, the death penalty, was the grand finale of the judicial process. But even here, class distinctions remained. The sword was the privilege of the nobility. Beheading was considered an honorable, quick death.
The victim would often tip the executioner with a purse of gold coins, a final bribe to ensure a sharp blade and a true aim. A skilled headsman could sever the neck in a single blow. A drunk or inexperienced one might hack 3 or 4 times, turning the execution into a butchery. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, famously took 3 blows, a gruesome scene where the executioner eventually had to saw through the remaining sinew. For the commoner, there was the rope. Hanging was not the long drop method invented in the 19th century that snapped the neck instantly. Medieval hanging was a slow strangulation. The condemned was pushed off a ladder or a cart, leaving them to dance on the air as the noose tightened against the windpipe. Friends or family might pull on the victim's legs to speed up the death and end the suffering. But for the crime of high treason, betraying the king, the law reserved its most creative cruelty: hanged, drawn, and quartered. This was a punishment designed to dismantle the human body in stages. The traitor was dragged by a horse to the place of execution. He was hanged by the neck, but cut down while still alive and conscious. Then the drawing began. The executioner would slice open the abdomen, pull out the intestines, and burn them in a fire before the victim's dying eyes. Finally, the heart was removed, ending the life. The corpse was then chopped into 4 quarters, which were boiled in salt and cumin to preserve them and prevent birds from eating them too quickly, and nailed up on the city gates as a warning. The head was dipped in tar and placed on a spike on London Bridge. It was total annihilation, denying the traitor a body to be buried and a peace in the afterlife. Yet perhaps the most bizarre chapter in medieval law involves the prosecution of animals. The medieval mind saw the world as a strict hierarchy: God, angels, men, animals. If an animal killed a human, it had disrupted this hierarchy and had to be punished. There are court records of pigs, bulls, and even swarms of insects being put on trial. The most famous case occurred in Falaise, France, in 1386. A sow, a female pig, had bitten the face of an infant child, causing its death. The pig was arrested and thrown into the local jail. It was given a defense lawyer. A trial was held with witnesses and a judge. The pig was found guilty of murder. The sentence was not just death, it was a ritualized execution. The pig was dressed in human clothes, a jacket and breeches. It was dragged to the town square and hanged by the neck from a gallows. This was not a joke. It was a serious legal proceeding to restore order to the universe. If a pig could kill a child without consequence, the world made no sense. By trying and executing the beast, the community reasserted the rule of law over the chaos of nature. In this world of fire, rope, and iron, the line between justice and vengeance was non-existent. The crowds that gathered to watch a burning or a hanging were not there merely for bloodlust. They were there to see morality enacted. In a life that was often short, confusing, and unjust, the sight of a criminal swinging from the gibbet provided a grim sense of closure, a reassurance that in the end, someone paid the price.
To leave the safety of the city walls or the familiarity of the village boundary in the Middle Ages was an act of bravery bordering on recklessness. In the modern imagination, travel is associated with leisure, discovery, and freedom. In the medieval reality, the word travel is derived from the French word travail, meaning work, suffering, or torment. This etymology was entirely appropriate. For the vast majority of the population, the world was incredibly small, limited to the distance a person could walk in a day. The horizon was not a beckoning line of opportunity, It was a terrifying threshold beyond which lay the unknown, a landscape of mud, wolves, and men who lived beyond the reach of God and the king. The infrastructure of travel was a crumbling ghost of a lost empire. The great stone roads built by the Romans had largely fallen into ruin, cannibalized for their quarried stone to build local churches and farmhouses. What remained were dirt tracks that turned into impassable quagmires in the winter and hard, rutted ankle breakers in the summer. A journey that takes an hour by car today would take 3 or 4 days of grueling slogging through the muck. The maintenance of these roads was theoretically the responsibility of the local lord or the parish, a system known as trinota necessitas, but in practice it was rarely done. Potholes were deep enough to break a horse's leg or overturn a cart, leaving the traveler stranded in the gathering dark. And darkness was the enemy. There were no streetlights, no reflective signs, no police patrols. When the sun went down, the countryside became a void. Travelers were urged to reach a walled town before the curfew bell rang. The word curfew comes from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. It was the signal to extinguish lights and lock the gates. If you were stuck outside the walls when the bell tolled, you were on your own, left to the mercy of the elements and the night walkers. Who, then, would dare to travel? Aside from merchants guarding their goods and soldiers marching to war, the most common travelers were pilgrims. Pilgrimage was the medieval equivalent of tourism, but with a life-or-death spiritual stake. Men and women would pin a lead badge to their hats, a scallop shell for St. James of Compostela, a vernicle for Rome, or an ampulla for Canterbury, and set off on foot. This badge was a passport of sorts, theoretically granting them safe passage through warring territories. In reality, a lone pilgrim was easy prey. They carried coin to pay for food and lodging, making them prime targets for the brigands who infested the forests. The forest in the Middle Ages was not just a collection of trees, it was a legal designation. It was land set aside for the king's hunting, subject to harsh forest laws. But these vast, unpoliced woodlands were also the realm of the outlaw. The term is literal, a man who is outside the law. If a man committed a serious crime and fled justice, he was declared an outlaw. The legal term used was caput lupinum, meaning wolf's head. This meant that the man was no longer considered human in the eyes of the law. He was a wolf. He could be hunted and killed by anyone without penalty. There was no trial for an outlaw. His head was the proof of justice.
These men banded together in the deep woods, not as romantic, merry men fighting for the poor, but as desperate, violent gangs who survived by ambushing travelers. They would stretch ropes across the road to trip horses, swarm the fallen riders, and strip them of everything: money, clothes, and sometimes their lives. The fear of the woods was so deep that laws required the undergrowth to be cleared for 200 feet on either side of major highways, just to prevent archers from lurking in the bushes. If the traveler survived the road and the robbers, they faced the ordeal of the medieval inn. These were not the cozy, sanitized taverns of fantasy novels. A medieval inn or hostelry was a chaotic, smelly, and often dangerous place. You identified them by the ale stake, a long pole with a bush of leaves tied to the end, sticking out horizontally from the building. Privacy at an inn was non-existent. You did not rent a room, you rented a space in a bed, and the bed was communal. A traveler might find themselves sleeping 3 or 4 to a mattress, huddled next to complete strangers, a merchant, a drover, a friar. You slept with your money pouch tied around your groin and your knife in your hand. The beds themselves were notoriously infested.
A common greeting or warning of the time was, "Good night, sleep tight, don't let the bedbugs bite," a phrase that had a literal and itchy significance. The mattresses were stuffed with straw, which, if not changed frequently, became a nesting ground for fleas, lice, and mice. The food served in these establishments was often suspect. Innkeepers were frequently accused of dishonesty in the court records. They were known to water down the ale, sell wine that had turned to vinegar, and bake pies using meat that was unwholesome, a polite term for roadkill or diseased livestock. The alewife, a woman who brewed and sold beer, was a stock character in medieval comedy and cautionary tales, often depicted in church murals as being dragged to hell by demons for the sin of shortchanging her customers. Sanitation at the inn was primitive. If you needed to relieve yourself in the night, you used a chamber pot kept under the bed, the same pot used by the strangers sleeping next to you. In the morning, the contents were simply thrown out the window into the street gutter, adding to the filth that defined the urban environment. Yet, despite the filth and the danger, the road was a place of transformation. It was where the rigid social hierarchy of the Middle Ages blurred slightly. On the road, a knight might have to ask a peasant for directions. A monk might share a fire with a soldier. It was a place of news. In a world without newspapers or postal services, the traveler was the internet of the age. Arriving in a village, a traveler would be mobbed for information. Is the king dead? Is there plague in the next town? Is there war? There was also the phenomenon of sanctuary. If a criminal could run fast enough to reach a church and touch the door knocker or sit in a specific stone chair near the altar, the frith stool, they could claim sanctuary. For 40 days, the law could not touch them. The sheriff and his men would have to camp outside the churchyard, watching the exits. Inside, the fugitive lived on charity and the protection of God. After 40 days, they had to choose, surrender and face trial, or confess their guilt and abjure the realm. To abjure the realm meant taking an oath to leave the country forever. The coroner would assign them a specific port, and they had to walk there, barefoot and carrying a wooden cross, straying strictly on the highway. If they strayed, they could be executed instantly. It was a grim, lonely walk of exile, a final journey for the unwanted. For the medieval mind, the ultimate journey was, of course, the Crusades. This was travel on an industrial scale, driven by fanaticism. Tens of thousands of people, knights, peasants, and even children, sold everything they owned to walk thousands of miles to Jerusalem. Most died of dysentery before ever seeing a Saracen. Those who returned brought back not just scars, but new tastes, spices, silks, and the seeds of the cultural awakening that would eventually end the Middle Ages. But for the average person, the world remained small. A journey to the next market town to sell a pig was an event. A trip to the cathedral city was a lifetime achievement. The road was a dark, muddy ribbon that led into the void, and every time a person stepped onto it, they were gambling with their life, trusting in the scallop shell on their hat and the knife at their belt.
The sun eventually sets on every era, even one as long and shadowed as the Middle Ages. But the darkness did not lift in a single moment of revelation. It retreated slowly, pushed back by the grinding mechanics of change. The end of this 1,000-year chapter was not marked by a parade, but by the scratching of a pen and the turning of a screw. When Johannes Gutenberg developed the movable type printing press in the mid-15th century, he did not just invent a machine, he broke the silence of the world. Before this, knowledge was a hoarded treasure, locked in hand-copied manuscripts inside cold monastery libraries, accessible only to the Latin-speaking elite.
The press flooded the continent with paper. Ideas about medicine, law, and scripture began to travel faster than the plague. The monopoly of the gatekeepers, the priest and the lord, began to fracture. Yet even as the Renaissance began to bloom in Italy, painting the world in perspective and celebrating the potential of man, the grim reality of the streets remained largely unchanged for the common folk. The stench of the open sewers did not vanish because Michelangelo was carving marble. The rats did not leave the thatched roofs because Copernicus declared the earth revolved around the sun. The transition from the medieval to the modern was a messy, overlapping smear of time, where the old terrors coexisted with the new discoveries. The true death knell of the medieval system was, ironically, the very thing that had killed so many of its people, the Black Death. The pestilence had been so thorough in its grim work that it altered the economics of survival. With half the workforce dead, the surviving peasant suddenly found himself in possession of something he had never had before: leverage. The lords needed labor to harvest the crops, and there were not enough hands to do the work. For the first time, the peasant could demand a wage. He could negotiate. The rigid bonds of serfdom, the system that tied a man to the land like a tree, began to snap. The grim reality had forced a renegotiation of human value. The survivor of the plague was better fed and better paid than his grandfather had been, simply because he was alive. As we look back through the lens of history at these centuries of mud and stone, it is easy to judge them with a sense of modern superiority. We shudder at the lack of dentistry, the bloodletting, the trial by ordeal, and the chamber pots emptied into the street. We recoil at the misogyny that labeled women as misbegotten men, and the superstition that saw demons in the shadows. But to dismiss the Middle Ages as merely a time of ignorance is to miss the profound resilience of the human spirit. These were people who lived without the safety nets we take for granted. They had no antibiotics to turn a deadly infection into a minor inconvenience. They had no central heating to banish the winter. They had no police to answer a cry for help in the night. And yet they built the cathedrals, mountains of stone that seemed to float on glass, engineered without calculators, rising from the midst of squalid towns to touch the infinite. They invented the university. They laid the foundations of the legal systems we use today. They preserved the literature of antiquity through the collapse of empires. The legacy of their private lives remains with us, woven into the very fabric of our language and our habits, often in ways we no longer recognize. When we speak of a threshold, we are remembering the piece of wood held at the bottom of the doorway to keep the thresh, straw flooring, from spilling out. When we say sleep tight, we are echoing the need to tighten the ropes that held up the sagging mattresses of the medieval bed. When we attend a wake, we are reenacting the vigil held over the dead to ensure they were truly gone and not merely in a coma, waiting to wake up in a sealed coffin. The stew we eat, the curfew we impose on teenagers, and the bonfire or bonefire we light, all are echoes of a time when life was raw, visceral, and dangerously immediate. To understand the private lives of the Middle Ages is to understand the history of our own bodies. We are the descendants of the survivors. We are the children of the women who survived the bedding ceremony and the childbirths without antisepsis. We are the heirs of the men who survived the wars, the famine, and the toxic bread. Our genetic code carries the memory of those who managed to dodge the plague. In a very real sense, their grit is our inheritance. As the fires in the great hearths of history burn down to embers, leaving the medieval world to fade into the gray mist of the past, we are left with a final quiet image. It is not of a king on a throne or a knight in battle. It is the image of a family in a single-room hut, huddled together for warmth on a straw mattress. The shutters are closed against the night air. The animals are breathing softly in the corner. The smell of wood smoke and unwashed wool hangs heavy in the air. Outside, the church bell tolls the hour, and the wind howls through the forest where the outlaws wait. It is a world of immense darkness and terrifying uncertainty. But in that small, crowded room, there is warmth. There is the beating of hearts. There is the endurance of life against the odds. The grim reality of the Middle Ages was a test of human endurance, a 1,000-year winter of the soul, and the fact that we are here today, looking back at them, is proof that they passed the test. The noise of the modern world fades, the electric lights dim, and we return, in our dreams, to the silence of the stone and the long, deep sleep of history.